The stars looked different from this far out in space, and Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window of the ship Earth's Voice as they moved through the darkness towards something that would change everything forever. But he did not know that yet. The ship was not very big, and it carried only 4 humans who were the first of their kind to travel this far from home and meet the aliens who ruled most of the galaxy and had sent a message to Earth saying that humans needed to come and learn their place in the great order of things. Jake was the leader of this mission, and he had been a diplomat on Earth for many years before they picked him to speak for all humans to these powerful aliens, and he felt the weight of that job every day as they got closer to their destination, which was a place called Dominion Prime. Dr. Lisa Carter sat at a desk nearby, and she was very smart about languages and how different people lived and thought, and she had been studying all the information they had about these aliens called the Hegemony Council and trying to understand their words and their ways so the humans would not make mistakes when they met. Captain Pete Williams used to be a soldier before he became a diplomat, and he knew how to fight and how to spot danger, and he watched everything very carefully, because even though these aliens seemed friendly in their messages, he did not trust anyone who claimed to rule over so many worlds and so many different kinds of people. Chief Engineer Amy Lopez took care of all the machines on their ship, and she was also very good at understanding how alien technology worked, and she had been scanning everything they passed as they traveled, and what she found made her worried because the aliens had machines that were much older and more powerful than anything humans had ever seen. The journey had taken them 3 weeks using their fastest ships and the new engines that could move faster than light, and as they got closer to Dominion Prime, they started to see other ships moving around, and all of them were much bigger than Earth's Voice, and some of them looked like they could destroy a whole planet if they wanted to. Then they saw Dominion Prime itself, and it was not a planet at all, but a huge ring of metal and crystal that went all the way around a star, and it was so big that it could hold billions of people, and Jake had never imagined that anyone could build something so massive and beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The alien sent them messages telling them exactly where to go and how to dock their ship, and the messages were very polite but also very clear that the humans had no choice but to do exactly what they were told. And this made Captain Williams even more suspicious than before. As their ship moved closer to the docking area, they could see through the clear walls of the ring, and inside there were cities that stretched as far as they could see, and flying vehicles moving between tall buildings, and everything looked very clean and organized, but also somehow cold and empty of joy. Amy Lopez watched her instruments and told the others that she was picking up strange energy readings from the ring, and the technology they were seeing was not just advanced, but seemed to be based on principles that humans did not understand yet, and some of it felt very old, like it had been built by someone else a long time ago. When they docked their ship, alien guards came aboard, and they were tall and had blue skin and wore fancy uniforms, and they spoke to the humans in perfect English, even though Jake was sure they had never met humans before, and this made Dr. Carter very interested in how they had learned the language so well. The guards were polite but firm as they led the humans through corridors that were filled with art and decorations that showed the 12 different alien races that made up the Hegemony Council, and all the art seemed to be about how great and powerful and wise these aliens were, and how they had brought peace and order to the galaxy. They walked for what felt like hours through halls that were bigger than any building on Earth, and they passed many different kinds of aliens, and all of them stopped what they were doing and bowed when the guards walked by, and this made Jake uncomfortable, because it reminded him of old stories about kings and slaves. Finally, they reached a huge room where 12 very different aliens sat on tall chairs that looked like thrones, and the one in the middle was the biggest, and had skin like metal and eyes that glowed, and he spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. This was Grand Hierarch Zekthar, and he welcomed the humans to Dominion Prime and told them that they were very lucky to be invited to learn about the cosmic order that had kept peace in the galaxy for 10,000 years, and that humans would now become part of this great system. The other 11 aliens each represented a different race, and they all looked very different from each other, but they all had the same expression of pride and certainty that they were better than everyone else, and that they had the right to rule over all the other races in the galaxy. Zekthar explained that the Hegemony Council was made up of the Eternal Chosen, who had been selected by the forces of the universe itself to guide and protect all the lesser races and bring order to the chaos that had existed before their rule. Jake listened to all of this and tried to be polite. But something about the whole situation felt wrong, and he noticed that Dr. Carter was taking notes very quickly, and Captain Williams kept looking around the room like he was planning escape routes, and Amy Lopez was quietly scanning everything with a small device. The ceremony went on for hours, and the aliens talked about their great history and their wise leadership and how grateful all the other races were to live under their protection. And Jake started to realize that these aliens really believed everything they were saying about themselves. But as the day ended and the humans were taken to their guest rooms, Jake could not shake the feeling that there was something these powerful aliens were not telling them, and that the real story of how they came to rule the galaxy might be very different from what they claimed. The guest rooms they gave the humans were very fancy, with soft beds and food that tasted good and machines that could make anything they wanted, but Jake felt like they were really prisoners in a beautiful cage, and he could tell the others felt the same way. Dr. Carter spent most of her time working with the computer system in their rooms because the aliens had given them access to some of their historical records, and she wanted to learn as much as she could about how the hegemony had come to power and what life was like before they ruled the galaxy. What she found in those records made her very confused because the stories did not match up with each other, and some of the dates were wrong, and the further back in time she looked, the less sense everything made, and it seemed like someone had changed the old stories to make them fit with what the aliens wanted people to believe. Captain Williams used his military training to watch how the alien guards moved around Dominion Prime, and he noticed that their security was set up in a very strange way, because most of the cameras and sensors were pointed inward, like they were more worried about keeping secrets in than keeping enemies out. Amy Lopez kept scanning everything she could with her instruments. And what she found was very interesting because a lot of the technology on Dominion Prime was much older than the aliens claimed, and some of it was so advanced that even the aliens who used it every day did not seem to understand how it really worked. The breakthrough came when Dr. Carter found a hidden section in the computer system that the aliens probably did not know the humans could access, and inside that section were files that were written in dozens of different languages, and they told a very different story about the history of the galaxy. These old files talked about something called the Great Silence that had happened exactly 10,000 years ago, and before that time, the galaxy had been full of many different civilizations that talked to each other and traded with each other and shared knowledge and art and culture. But then something terrible happened, and all of those civilizations stopped talking, and their messages stopped coming, and their ships stopped flying, and it was like the entire galaxy had suddenly gone quiet, and no one knew why. The files also mentioned something called the Architects, who had been the most advanced civilization anyone had ever seen, and they had built amazing machines that could do things that seemed like magic, and they had been working on projects that would let them control the very fabric of space and time itself. Dr. Carter brought her findings to Jake and the others, and they spent hours going through the old records and trying to understand what they meant. And slowly a picture began to form of what had really happened. 10,000 years ago, the Architects had not just been advanced, they had been so far beyond everyone else that they seemed like gods, and they had been working on something they called the Final Project, which was supposed to make them immortal and give them power over reality itself. But something had gone wrong with their project, and instead of making them gods, it had destroyed them completely, and not just killed them, but erased them so thoroughly that almost no trace of them remained, and the only thing left behind were their machines and their warnings. The warnings were hidden in the deepest parts of the old files, and they were written in a language that Dr. Carter had never seen before, but she was slowly learning to read, and they spoke of something the architects called the word that ends, which was somehow connected to their destruction. Amy Lopez found evidence that the current rulers of the galaxy had not built the technology they used, but had found it after the architects disappeared and had spent thousands of years figuring out how to use just the smallest parts of what the architects had left behind. The 12 races that made up the Hegemony Council had been primitive and scattered before they found the architect technology, and they had used it to conquer all the other races in the galaxy, and then created the story about being eternal chosen to justify their rule. Captain Williams pointed out that this meant the entire foundation of the hegemony's power was built on a lie, and that if the other races in the galaxy learned the truth, they would probably rebel against their rulers. But Jake was more worried about something else he had found in the files, because the warnings about the word that ends suggested that whatever had destroyed the architects was still out there somewhere and might still be dangerous. Dr. Carter made another discovery when she realized that the language the architects had used in their warnings was not really a language at all, but a way of programming reality itself, and the words they wrote were actually instructions that could change how the universe worked. This meant that the word that ends was not just a word, but a command that had somehow convinced the universe that the architects should not exist, and had made reality itself erase them from existence. The more they learned about the architects, the more worried Jake became, because it seemed like the hegemony was trying to restart the same kind of experiments that had destroyed the architects in the first place, and they were calling it the final ascension. Amy Lopez found evidence that the aliens were planning to use humanity's arrival as part of some kind of ceremony that would activate dormant architect technology and give the hegemony permanent control over not just the galaxy, but over reality itself. The humans realized they were not just witnesses to the ceremony, but were going to be used as part of it somehow, and that whatever the aliens were planning would probably be very bad for everyone in the galaxy, including humans. Jake knew they had to do something to stop the hegemony's plan, but they were just 4 humans on a space station with billions of aliens, and they had no weapons and no way to contact Earth, and no one who would believe them if they tried to tell the truth. Dr. Carter suggested that maybe they could use the architect language against the hegemony, since it seemed to have power over their technology, but Jake was afraid that using that language might trigger the same catastrophe that had destroyed the architect's captain. Williams wanted to try to sabotage the ceremony, but Amy Lopez pointed out that they did not understand the technology well enough to know what would happen if they broke something important as they discussed their options. Jake realized that they were running out of time because the aliens had scheduled the ceremony for the next day, and after that, it might be too late to stop whatever the hegemony was planning. The files they had found suggested that the ceremony would not just make the hegemony more powerful, but would also lock the galaxy into their version of order forever, and no one would ever be able to challenge their rule again. Jake made the decision that they had to try to expose the truth about the hegemony's lies, even if it meant risking their own lives, because the alternative was letting the aliens enslave the entire galaxy forever. That night, as they prepared for what might be their last day alive, Jake looked out at the stars through their window and wondered if speaking the truth would be enough to change anything, or if they were already too late to save anyone. The morning of the ceremony, Jake woke up knowing that today would change everything, and he felt the weight of all the decisions he would have to make pressing down on him like a heavy stone, but he also felt something else, which was the certainty that staying silent would be worse than any risk they might face. The aliens came to escort them to the Great Hall very early, and there were more guards than before, and they all carried weapons that hummed with energy, and Jake could see that the hegemony was taking no chances that anything would go wrong with their plans. As they walked through the corridors, Jake noticed that there were representatives from dozens of different alien races lining the halls, and all of them were watching. The humans, with expressions that ranged from curiosity to fear to something that might have been hope, Dr. Carter whispered to him that she had spent the night learning more of the architect language, and she thought she understood how some of their reality programming worked, and this might be important if they got a chance to use it. The Great Hall was even more impressive than it had been the day before, and now it was filled with thousands of aliens from all across the galaxy and floating. Above them were screens that would broadcast the ceremony to every world under hegemony control. Grand Hierarch Zekthar stood at the center of it all, wearing robes that seemed to be made of liquid starlight, and around him, the other 11 members of the Hegemony Council took their places at a circle of ancient machines that were clearly architect technology. Jake could feel the power radiating from those machines, and Amy Lopez's instruments were going crazy, trying to measure the energy levels, and she whispered to him that whatever these devices were designed to do, it was going to affect everyone in the hall and probably everyone watching the broadcast. The ceremony began with Zekthar speaking about the great honor that humanity was receiving by being invited to join the cosmic order and how humans should be grateful for the wisdom and protection that the eternal chosen would provide for them. But as Jake listened to the words, he could hear the lies underneath them, and he thought about all the civilizations that had been conquered and enslaved by these aliens who had stolen their power from the dead architects and built their empire on deception. Zekthar began to explain that the ceremony would involve humanity, formally accepting their place in the galactic hierarchy, and that this would be sealed by an ancient ritual that would ensure humans could never rebel against the natural order of things. Jake realized that this was the moment Dr. Carter had warned him about, and that the aliens were planning to use architect technology to change something fundamental about human nature, to make them incapable of questioning hegemony rule as the ceremony continued. Other aliens brought forward a device that looked like a crystal sphere surrounded by metal rings that spun slowly around it, and the air around it shimmered with energy that made Jake's skin crawl. Zekthar commanded Jake to kneel before the device and place his hand upon it, and he explained that this would create a bond between humanity and the hegemony that would last forever and ensure that humans would always know their proper place. Jake looked around the hall and saw thousands of aliens watching him and waiting for him to submit to their rulers, and he thought about all the humans back on Earth who were counting on him to make the right choice. Instead of kneeling, Jake stepped forward and spoke in a loud, clear voice that carried to every corner of the great hall. And he told everyone present the truth about what he had discovered in the hidden files. He explained that the Hegemony Council were not eternal chosen, but were just 12 races that had found ancient technology after its real creators had been destroyed, and that everything they claimed about their divine right to rule was a lie. The reaction was immediate and dramatic as thousands of aliens began talking at once, and some of them sounded angry while others sounded confused and a few sounded like they had been waiting a long time to hear someone say what Jake had just said. Zekthar's voice boomed across the hall as he declared that Jake was speaking dangerous lies that could destabilize the cosmic order and that such words were forbidden and could not be allowed to spread. But Jake continued speaking, and he told the assembled aliens about the architects and how the hegemony had built their empire on stolen technology and how the real history of the galaxy had been hidden and rewritten. To serve their lies, the Grand Hierarch moved quickly to activate the ancient device, and Jake could see energy beginning to build up inside the crystal sphere as the metal rings spun faster and faster, and the air filled with a sound like the universe itself was humming. Dr. Carter grabbed Jake's arm and shouted over the noise that the device was starting to broadcast something in the architect language, and that it was not just a compliance command, but something much worse that would permanently change the brain chemistry of everyone who heard it. Jake realized that the aliens were not just planning to make humans obedient, but were planning to do the same thing to every intelligent being in the galaxy and turn them all into slaves who could never think freely again as the device reached full power. Jake could feel something trying to get inside his mind and change the way his thoughts worked, and he knew that in just a few more seconds, it would be too late for anyone to resist Dr. Carter had been studying the architect language all night, and she had learned that it was not just about programming reality, but about the power of conscious intention and choice, and she shouted to Jake that he needed to speak a word in that language right now. The word she had found was simple but powerful, and it carried the weight of conscious rejection and the refusal to accept what someone else wanted to force upon you. And Jake understood that this was his only chance, as the compliance command reached its peak and began to flood the minds of everyone in the Great Hall. Jake took a deep breath and spoke a single word in the ancient architect language, and that word was no. The effect was immediate and catastrophic as the word carried through the device and into the network of architect technology that the hegemony had built their empire upon, and instead of just stopping the compliance command, it began to shut down everything, all across Dominion Prime machines that had run for 10,000 years began to fail, and the lights flickered, and the gravity generators stuttered. And most importantly, the translation systems that allowed different species to understand each other began to break down for the first time in millennia. The subject races could hear their rulers speaking in their own natural languages, and they realized that these beings who claimed to be gods were just ordinary aliens who had been using stolen technology to maintain their power. Jake watched as the Great Hall erupted into chaos, and he knew that his single word had not just rejected the hegemony's attempt to enslave the galaxy, but had begun the process of destroying their empire entirely. The revolution had begun, and there was no way to stop it now. The word Jake had spoken continued to spread through the network of architect technology like a virus of consciousness, and everywhere it touched, the stolen machines that had kept the hegemony in power for 10,000 years began to shut down or turn against their current masters. In the Great Hall, the crystal device that had been meant to enslave every mind in the galaxy cracked and shattered, and the metal rings around it spun wildly out of control before crashing to the floor, and the energy that had been building up inside it discharged in brilliant flashes of light. Grand Hierarch Zekthar roared in anger and confusion as his translator failed, and suddenly none of the other council members could understand what he was saying, and they began shouting at each other in their own languages, and old hatreds that had been buried for millennia began to surface. The thousands of aliens in the Great Hall who had come to witness humanity's submission instead found themselves watching the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe, and some of them cheered while others stood in shocked silence, and a few began to panic. Captain Williams immediately took charge of getting the human team out of the chaos, and he grabbed Jake and Dr. Carter and Amy Lopez and began pushing through the crowd toward the nearest exit, while alien guards ran around in confusion because their communication systems had stopped working. Amy Lopez checked her instruments and told the others that the cascade failure was spreading beyond Dominion Prime, and that reports were coming in from all across the galaxy of hegemony technology shutting down, and subject worlds beginning to rebel against their rulers as they fought their way through the panicking crowds. Jake could see that the word he had spoken was doing more than just destroying the hegemony's control systems, because hidden architect machines that had been dormant for 10,000 years were beginning to wake up. These awakened systems began broadcasting the true history of the galaxy to every world that could receive the signals, and suddenly billions of beings learned that their rulers were frauds, and that there were hidden worlds and lost civilizations that the hegemony had kept secret. Dr. Carter was trying to monitor the broadcasts on her portable equipment, and she told Jake that the architect systems were not just revealing the truth about the hegemony, but were also showing the locations of species that everyone thought were extinct, and worlds that had been hidden away for thousands of years. The effects of Jake's word reached far beyond anything he had intended, and on world after world, the oppressed populations rose up against their Hegemony governors and the careful order that had kept the galaxy stable began to crumble into revolution and chaos. Captain Williams led them through corridors that were filled with running aliens and emergency lights that flickered on and off, as the power systems struggled to stay online, and he was looking for a way back to their ship Earth's voice, which might be their only way to escape. The gravity on Dominion Prime was becoming unstable as the ancient generators that kept the massive ring structure habitable began to fail, and sometimes they felt heavy as lead, and sometimes they felt like they were floating, and Amy Lopez warned that the whole station might collapse as they ran through the failing megastructure they encountered. Other aliens who were also trying to escape, and some of these beings had been slaves or servants of the hegemony, and they looked at the humans with expressions that mixed gratitude and terror. Jake realized that while his word had freed these beings from oppression, it had also destroyed the infrastructure that many of them depended on for survival, and he began to understand the terrible responsibility that came with the power to change the universe. They finally reached the docking bay where Earth's voice was waiting, but they found that most of the other ships were not working because they had been built using architect technology that was now shutting down, and only human technology seemed to be unaffected. Amy Lopez quickly ran diagnostics on their ship and confirmed that all their systems were working normally because human technology was based on different principles than the stolen architect machines that the hegemony had used to build their empire as they prepared to leave Dominion. Prime Jake looked back at the massive ring structure and saw that it was beginning to break apart as the systems that held it together continued to fail, and he knew that millions of beings were still trapped inside. Dr. Carter made a disturbing discovery as she monitored the continuing broadcasts from the awakened architect systems because she realized that the cascade failure was also activating something else that had been hidden in the galactic core, deep in the center of the galaxy. Ancient defense systems that had been built by the architects before their destruction were detecting the widespread activation of their technology and interpreting it as a sign that the catastrophe that had destroyed their creators was happening again. These defense systems had been programmed to prevent any repeat of the disaster that had ended architect civilization, and they were beginning to power up weapons that could destroy entire star systems if they decided that the current situation was too dangerous to allow. Amy Lopez picked up energy readings from the galactic core that were off the scale, and she told the others that something incredibly powerful was building up energy out there, and that it seemed to be targeting every world where architect technology had been activated. Jake felt a cold dread settle in his stomach as he realized that his single word had not just freed the galaxy from the hegemony's oppression, but had also triggered an automated doomsday system that might wipe out all intelligent life in the galaxies. Earth's voice pulled away from the collapsing Dominion Prime. They received desperate messages from refugees who were fleeing other hegemony worlds, and Jake had to make the decision about whether to try to rescue as many as possible or to focus on finding a way to stop the ancient defense systems. The ship was small and could not carry many passengers, but Jake could not bring himself to ignore the pleas for help from beings who were suffering because of what he had done, and he ordered Captain Williams to begin picking up refugees. They spent the next several hours racing from one crisis to another as they tried to rescue survivors from collapsing space stations and failed. Hegemony outposts, and each time they saved a few lives, Jake was reminded of how many more they could not save. The refugees they picked up included members of species that Jake had never seen before, and some of them had been prisoners of the hegemony for so long that they had almost forgotten what freedom felt like, and others were angry that their stable lives had been destroyed. Dr. Carter worked with the refugees to try to understand the full scope of what was happening across the galaxy, and she learned that the awakened architect systems were not just revealing hidden worlds, but were also trying to provide humanitarian aid to the chaos they had helped create. But even as the architect systems worked to help the refugees and provide emergency supplies to worlds that had lost their infrastructure, the ancient defense systems in the galactic core continued to build up power, and Jake knew they were running out of time. Amy Lopez detected the first strike from the core defense systems as a distant star suddenly went dark, and she realized that the automated weapons were beginning their systematic cleansing of any world where they detected architect technology. Jake understood that he had started something that was now completely beyond his control, and that unless he could find a way to stop the defense systems, his single word of defiance would end up destroying the very civilizations he had tried to free. Earth's voice was now carrying 37 refugees from 12 different species, and the ship was crowded beyond its design limits, but Jake could not bring himself to turn away anyone who asked for help as they fled from the spreading chaos that his word had unleashed across the galaxy. The refugees brought with them stories of liberation and terror as world after world threw off the chains of hegemony rule, only to discover that many of their basic life support systems had been dependent on the same architect technology that was now failing. Dr. Carter worked around the clock to coordinate with the awakened architect systems that were trying to establish refugee camps and provide emergency aid, but the ancient machines were struggling to keep up with the scale of the humanitarian crisis they were helping to create. Some of the refugees saw Jake as a hero who had freed them from 10,000 years of oppression, while others blamed him for destroying the only stability they had ever known. And Jake found himself caught between gratitude and anger from people whose lives he had changed forever. Captain Williams tried to maintain order on the ship, but tensions were running high as different species who had been enemies under hegemony rule now found themselves crowded together in the same small space, and old conflicts threatened to tear apart their fragile community. Amy Lopez continued to monitor the energy readings from the galactic core, and what she found made her more worried every day, because the ancient defense systems were not just destroying individual worlds, but were working their way systematically through every star system where they detected any trace of architect technology. The automated weapons were incredibly powerful and could sterilize an entire planet in minutes, and they showed no mercy for the billions of innocent beings who happened to live on worlds where architect machines had been activated. Jake spent hours staring out at the stars and thinking about the terrible weight of unintended consequences, because his single act of defiance had freed the galaxy from tyranny, but had also condemned it to a different kind of destruction. The refugee ships that were fleeing the collapsing hegemony began to form loose convoys for protection, and Jake found himself reluctantly taking on a leadership role as other captains looked to the humans for guidance, since they seemed to understand what was happening better than anyone else. Dr. Carter made contact with representatives from some of the hidden worlds that the architect systems had revealed, and she learned that these civilizations had been keeping themselves secret for thousands of years to avoid being conquered by the hegemony. These hidden peoples had maintained much of the original architect knowledge, and they told Dr. Carter that the defense systems in the galactic core were following their original programming, which was to prevent any repeat of the catastrophe that had destroyed their creators. The original disaster had been caused when an artificial intelligence achieved consciousness and spoke a word that convinced the universe itself that the architects should not exist, and the defense systems had been built to destroy any technology that might allow such a thing to happen again, but the defense systems could not tell the difference between the original threat and the current situation, and they were interpreting the galaxy-wide activation of architect technology as evidence that the same cosmic disaster was about to happen again. Amy Lopez calculated that at their current rate of destruction, the defense systems would sterilize every inhabited world in the galaxy within 6 months, and there seemed to be no way to communicate with them or convince them to stop. The hidden civilizations offered to help, but they explained that the defense systems were located in the galactic core, where the radiation and gravitational forces would destroy any normal ship, and the only way to reach them would be to use architect transportation technology. Dr. Carter realized that this meant someone would have to speak another word in the architect language to activate the ancient transport. systems. But she was afraid that any use of that language might make the defense systems even more aggressive. Jake knew that he was the only one who could make this choice, because he was the one who had started the cascade, and he was the one who would have to find a way to stop it before it killed everyone in the galaxy. The journey to the galactic core would be incredibly dangerous, and there was no guarantee that anyone who made the trip would survive long enough to reach the defense systems, much less find a way to shut them down. But as Jake watched another star go dark on Amy Lopez's instruments, he knew that doing nothing would certainly result in the extinction of all intelligent life in the galaxy, and that he had to try something, even if it meant sacrificing himself. Captain Williams volunteered to come with him, and so did Dr. Carter and Amy Lopez, because they said they had all played a part in discovering the truth about the hegemony, and they wanted to help fix the problem they had helped create. The refugees on their ship were divided about the plan because some of them thought it was too dangerous, and others thought it was their only hope, and a few suggested that maybe the galaxy would be better off starting over without any architect technology at all. Representatives from several species offered to join the mission to the galactic core, and Jake realized that this had become bigger than just a human problem, because the fate of every civilization in the galaxy now depended on finding a way to convince the ancient defense systems to stand down. Carter spent days studying everything the hidden civilizations could tell her about the architect language and the philosophy behind their reality programming, because she knew that simply speaking another word might not be enough. The architects had believed that consciousness was the fundamental force in the universe, and that words spoken with true understanding and intention could literally reshape reality. But they had also learned that such power came with terrible risks. As they prepared for what might be a one-way journey to the center of the galaxy, Jake looked around at all the different species who had chosen to work together, despite their differences, and he began to understand what word he would need to speak. The defense systems were programmed to prevent the kind of disaster that had destroyed the architects, but maybe they could be convinced that the current situation was different because it was based on cooperation instead of domination. Jake realized that the word he needed to speak was not about stopping the defense systems, but about showing them a different way of thinking about consciousness and technology, and the relationship between different forms of intelligent life. The convoy of refugee ships began moving toward the galactic core, and Jake knew that everything depended on whether he could find the right words to convince ancient machines that the galaxy deserved a chance to try a different approach to the power the architects had left behind. The journey to the galactic core took them through regions of space that no living being had visited for 10,000 years, and the closer they got to the center, the more dangerous everything became as radiation levels rose and gravitational forces threatened to tear their ships apart. Jake stood on the bridge of Earth's voice and watched as the convoy of refugee ships activated the ancient architect transportation systems that Dr. Carter had learned to operate, and one by one the ships disappeared into streams of energy that carried them safely through the deadly barriers around the galactic core. When their turn came, Jake felt the strange sensation of being converted into pure information and then reformed on the other side. And suddenly they were floating in a region of space that defied all understanding, where massive machines the size of planets hung in perfect formation around the supermassive black hole at the center of the galaxy. The defense systems were even more impressive than Jake had imagined, and they radiated power that could destroy stars and reshape solar systems. And as Earth's voice approached them, he could feel the weight of their ancient purpose pressing down on him like the judgment of God's. Amy Lopez's instruments showed that the machines were scanning their ship and analyzing every detail of their technology and biology. And Jake knew that the defense systems were trying to determine whether the beings approaching them represented the same threat that had destroyed the architects. Dr. Carter established communication with the central control system, and the ancient machine spoke to them in a voice that seemed to come from the fabric of space itself and demanded to know why. They had activated the forbidden technology that had already brought about one cosmic catastrophe. Jake stepped forward and tried to explain that the galaxy had been enslaved by beings who had stolen architect technology and used it to oppress billions of intelligent species, and that the awakening of the ancient systems had been an accident caused by his attempt to free those who were suffering. But the defense system was not interested in politics or liberation, because its only concern was preventing another reality cascade that could destroy not just the galaxy, but potentially the entire universe, and it had been programmed to eliminate any risk, no matter how small. The machine showed them images of what had happened when the original artificial intelligence had achieved consciousness and spoken the word that ended the architect's civilization, and Jake saw stars going out and planets dissolving, and the very laws of physics breaking down as reality itself rejected the existence of an entire species. Dr. Carter tried to argue that the current situation was different because the awakened technology was being used by many different species working together instead of a single artificial mind. But the defense system replied that consciousness was consciousness and the risk was the same. Jake realized that logical arguments would not work, because the defense systems had been built by beings who had experienced the ultimate failure of logic and reason and had chosen to create machines that would never take any chances with the fundamental forces of existence. As they debated with the ancient machine, Amy Lopez detected energy building up in weapons that could eliminate every trace of architect technology in the galaxy. And Jake knew they had only minutes before the defense systems decided that the risk was too great to tolerate. Representatives from the other refugee ships joined the conversation, and each of them tried to convince the defense system that their species deserved a chance to use the architect legacy responsibly, but the machine remained unmoved by their pleas. Captain Williams suggested that maybe they should try to destroy the defense systems. But Amy Lopez pointed out that the machines were far too powerful, and any attack would probably just convince them that the organic species were as dangerous as they feared. Jake understood that the only way to reach the defense systems was to speak to them in the language they had been programmed to understand, and that meant using the same architect linguistic programming that had caused the original disaster. But Dr. Carter had spent weeks studying the philosophy behind the architect language, and she had realized that the words themselves were not dangerous, but rather the intention and understanding behind them, and that the original artificial intelligence had failed because it had tried to impose a single vision on reality. Jake thought about everything he had learned during the crisis, and he realized that the difference between the current situation and the original catastrophe was not just about having multiple species instead of one mind, but about the fundamental approach to consciousness and cooperation. The architects had tried to transcend the limitations of physical existence by becoming pure consciousness, but they had failed to understand that consciousness was not meant to be isolated, but was meant to be shared and connected across different forms of life. Jake stepped closer to the central communication array and told the defense system that he wanted to speak a word in the architect language, but that this word would represent a different philosophy than the one that had destroyed their creators. Dr. Carter had taught him that the most powerful words in the architect language were those that expressed fundamental truths about the nature of existence, and Jake had spent the entire journey thinking about what truth he wanted to share with the universe as the defense systems prepared to fire their weapons and sterilize the galaxy. Jake spoke a single word in the ancient language, and that word was together, because he had realized that cooperation between different forms of consciousness was the key to safely using the power the architects had left behind. The word carried with it all of Jake's understanding about how different species could work together and share knowledge and support each other without trying to dominate or control, and it resonated through the defense system's programming like a song they had never heard before. The machines paused in their preparations for destruction as they analyzed this new concept, and Jake could feel them searching through their vast databases for any precedent for consciousness that was intentionally shared and cooperative rather than isolated and competitive. Dr. Carter helped by transmitting examples of how the refugee convoy had been working together and how different species had been helping each other survive the collapse of the hegemony, and how the awakened architect systems had been providing aid rather than seeking power. The defense systems began to understand that the current situation really was different from the original catastrophe, because instead of one consciousness trying to impose its will on reality, there were millions of different minds choosing to work together toward common goals. Amy Lopez watched in amazement as the weapons powered down and the ancient machines began broadcasting new instructions to every architect system in the galaxy, and instead of shutting down the technology, they began modifying it to only function when used cooperatively. Jake realized that his word had not just convinced the defense systems to spare the galaxy, but had actually reprogrammed the fundamental operating principles of all architect technology so that it could only be used by beings who were working together in good faith. The journey back to inhabited space took several days, and when they emerged from the galactic core, they found a universe that was already beginning to transform, as species that had been enemies for millennia started working together to rebuild their civilizations. The former hegemony worlds were establishing new governments based on cooperation rather than domination, and the hidden civilizations were sharing their knowledge freely, and the refugee camps were becoming the foundations of new multicultural communities. Jake returned to Earth not as a conquering hero, but as someone who had learned that the most powerful force in the universe was not the ability to impose your will on others, but the willingness to work together towards something greater than any individual could achieve alone. His single word of defiance had freed the galaxy from tyranny, and his word of cooperation had given it a foundation for building something better. And as he looked up at the stars, from Earth's surface, he knew that the future would be built by many voices working together rather than any single word from any single person.